The Three Forks, July 25th, 1805. From the White Bear Islands, the canoes again advanced up the winding river. As the men toiled in the broiling heat, they glimpsed in the distance the cool snow-clad peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The hills closed in, forming two walls of rock that towered 1,200 feet from the water's edge. Nothing can be imagined more tremendous than the frowning darkness of these rocks, which project over the river and menace our destruction. For 5 miles they continued through this majestic canyon, which they called the Gates of the Rocky Mountains. Farther on, the country opened out into beautiful prairie surrounded on all sides by mountains. Through this country ran 3 rivers. They were called the Three Forks of the Missouri because at this point they joined to make the Great Missouri River. No single one of these streams could be truly called the Missouri, so the captains named them separately after 3 great heroes of democracy: Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin. Here all the Indian trails from over the mountains converged as they went down to the Buffalo Plains. For ages this has been a battleground between the eastern and western tribes. The men anxiously watched the shores for signs of Indians and carried American flags on the canoes to show that they were white men and friends. The Shoshones had taken refuge in these barren mountains from their enemies, the fierce Sioux, who had obtained guns from the white traders. Here the Shoshones were forced to live in semi-starvation on roots and berries. Their only wealth was plenty of good horses. On these they ventured down to the plains in the autumn to hunt the buffalo. Their scouts had seen the strangers on the river and had sent up a smoke signal to warn their people. Clark and 3 men had left the canoes before entering the gates of the Rockies and had pushed overland to see the Three Forks. Clark had gone on up the West Fork for 12 miles. While overheated, he drank deeply from an icy spring and became painfully ill. In spite of his sickness, on the way back to camp at the Three Forks, he had pulled Charbonneau out of a swift mountain stream into which he had fallen. The Frenchman had almost been drowned in the strong current. The river was rapidly becoming too shallow for navigation. They had no horses and had seen no Indians. Without guides and horses to carry their heavy baggage, the expedition could not cross the mountains which lay before them. Lost here in the heart of the Rockies, their situation would be desperate with winter coming on. As Clark was still ill, it was decided that Lewis should push on until he found Indians and horses, if it took a month. Indeed, he said he would not come back alive without them. The Vanishing Shoshones, the Continental Divide, August 12th through 13th, 1805. For 3 days, Lewis's party followed an old Indian trail. Drewer and Shields on each flank were to signal Lewis and McNeil in the center by waving their hats on their guns if they found fresh tracks. Coming over a rise, Lewis saw a moving speck in the distance. Through his glass, he could see a man riding bareback, carrying a bow and arrows. This must be a Shoshone at last. When the rider had got within about a mile, he stopped. Lewis waved his blanket 3 times, the Indian peace sign. He dropped his gun, took some beads and a mirror from his pack, and walked slowly toward the Indian. Signaling Drewer and Shields to halt, he pulled up his sleeves to show his white skin and went toward the Indian, holding out trinkets and calling Tababone, which Sacagawea had taught him meant white man in Shoshone. Just then Shields, who had not seen Lewis's signal, blundered forward. The Indian took fright, wheeled his horse, and dashed off into the underbrush. For some minutes, Lewis was furious with disappointment and scolded Shields for his stupidity. Their party followed the horseman's tracks all that day till they became lost. Next morning they continued on the old Indian trail which they had been following toward a gap in the mountains. As the stream narrowed, McNeil straddled it with his long legs, waving his flag and shouting, "Thank God I've lived to bestride the Missouri." They came to the place where the little brook welled up from the earth. This must be the very source of the Missouri. Here they rested, drank of the spring, and talked of their long adventure up the 3,000 miles of river. They crossed through the gap in the mountains and on the steep downward slope found a westward flowing brook. This meant they had crossed the very backbone of the continent. Here was water that had flowed into the Columbia River and down to the Pacific Ocean. Next morning they pushed on westward down the valley under a lofty mountain range. About a mile ahead of them they sighted figures. They could see a man, 2 women, and some dogs. Lewis put down his gun and advanced alone, waving an American flag. The Indians promptly disappeared, leaving only the dogs. Lewis tried in vain to catch one. He wanted to tie some beads around his neck and send him back to the Indians as a goodwill messenger. As they went on, the grass was trampled with the tracks of men and horses. They were close upon the Shoshones at last. Coming suddenly out of a ravine, they surprised 3 Indian women. One ran, but the other 2, one an old woman, the other a child, dropped on their knees with their heads bent to receive the tomahawk of the enemy. Lewis gave them mirrors and beads and painted their beaming faces with vermilion, a Shoshone emblem of peace. They all started toward the Indian camp. Suddenly Lewis saw a sight that made his heart leap for joy. 60 Shoshones warriors riding at full speed, the dust billowing out behind them. They were magnificent riders on superb horses. Any Virginian could see that. The Indian bands pulled up their horses as the squaws held out their presents. Lewis put down his gun and came forward with his flag. 3 chiefs leapt from their horses and ran up to give him the Shoshone hug, putting their left arms over his right shoulder and rubbing their painted cheeks against his and shouting, "Ahii, ahii," which meant, "I am much pleased." The other braves followed. 60 Shoshone hugs apiece had well greased the white men's faces with Indian paint, but Lewis was very happy. Chief Cameahwait rode into camp carrying the American flag, with Lewis following him and the Shoshone warriors bringing up the rear. Persuading the Shoshones, August 16, 1805. Lewis rose and faced the circle of 60 seated Shoshone warriors. They had pulled off their moccasins as a sign of good faith and friendship. The greenstone peace pipe had been passed around and all had smoked it. Behind them stood the women, children, and dogs gazing intently at the first white men they had ever seen. Lewis was anxiously aware that the success of the whole expedition now depended on the effect of his words on these suspicious savages. He paused frequently as Drewer translated in the dramatic pantomime of the Indian Sign Language. The white man had come to trade with the Indians. They brought the Indians guns, beads, knives, vermilion. They wished to cross the mountains and go to the great salt water beyond. If the tribe would return to the forks of the Jefferson with him, they would meet his brother chief with more white men who were being guided by a Shoshone woman, one of their own people. With them they would see a man whose skin was entirely black. The white men would trade many good things with the red men for their horses. After the speech, the usual presents were distributed: beads, ribbons, looking glasses, and vermilion paint. The strangers had not eaten since yesterday. Would their red brothers oblige with some food? The Indians had only some cakes of dried berries. They shared the last of them with the strangers. Lewis asked Chief Cameahwait many questions about the westward mountain streams, but the chief was sure that they were too wild and rocky for canoes to pass. Lewis now looked carefully at the herds of fine horses that grazed about the camp. That night the wary white men watched the Indians dance till midnight and then slept with the drums of the dancers sounding through their dreams. Lewis knew that Clark and his men were hauling their canoes up the shallow rapids of the Jefferson toward the Three Forks. Here he must meet them with horses and Indian guides if they were to cross the mountains before snow closed the passes. Cameahwait was friendly and willing to help, but his warriors, who had recently suffered a terrible defeat in battle with their enemies, the Paquis or Minnetaree, were suspicious and gun-shy with the strangers. Someone had circulated the unpleasant rumor that the white men were allies of their enemies and were planning to lead the Shoshones into a trap. Lewis repeated all the fine things the Indians would receive in trade for their horses. He was grieved the Indians could believe him so treacherous and false. They should know that the white men never lied. Were the Indians afraid to come and see if he spoke the truth? Were their warriors cowards? Were they afraid to die? But only Cameahwait and 6 or 8 of his warriors accompanied the party as they started back through the Lemhi Pass toward the forks amid the dismal wailing of the squaws. They had not gone far before a dozen more braves overtook them, and soon the whole tribe had changed their minds and followed. Before starting, the Indians had an antelope hunt, but it had been a complete failure and they were now without food. Lewis and his men were down to their last pound of flour. An Indian scout came racing back with news that Drewer, who was hunting ahead, had killed a deer. Lewis was carried along in the wild stampede of the tribe. He watched with disgust the Indians devour the raw entrails of the deer, which Drewer had thrown aside. The Shoshones had been terribly hungry for a long time. They might have simply taken the whole deer by force, but the Indian code said, "To the hunter belongs the kill." More deer were killed, and by the time the party arrived within 2 miles of the forks, the ravenous Indians had gorged their fills. As yet, there was no sign of Clark. The Indians were becoming very restless and increasingly suspicious of being ambushed. If the Shoshones should now bolt for the mountains, the whole expedition would be hopelessly abandoned in trackless country without horses or guides. Suppose Clark had not been able to get the canoes up the rapids? Lewis's anxiety increased, though he gave no outward sign of it. The Shoshones disguised the white men with furs and feathers so that they looked like Indians. In case of an ambush, they would be taken for Shoshones by the enemy. In return, Lewis placed his cocked hat and feather on Cameahwait's head as a token of his complete confidence. The 2 chiefs looked like figures in a masquerade. As a last desperate token, Lewis gave the chief his gun, telling him that he might shoot him as soon as they discovered themselves betrayed. The captain remembered the note he had left for Clark at the Forks, telling him which branch he had taken. He sent Drewer to get it and explained to Cameahwait that it was from his brother chief, saying he was not far away. That night Lewis laughed and joked among the uneasy Indians with a gaiety he did not feel. Through his dreams ran the uneasy refrain, "Can we hold them another day if Clark does not come?" Before dawn, Drewer left camp with a note to Clark from Lewis saying, "Hurry, hurry, hurry." Meanwhile, Clark and his exhausted men were sloshing through the icy waters of the Jefferson, dragging the canoes along the rattlesnake-infested rocks of its winding, shallow channel. From the top of a hill near where they had camped, he could see the forks, only 4 miles away. Next morning, Clark, Charbonneau, and Sacagawea walked along shore while the canoes followed the winding course of the river. Clark was amazed to see Sacagawea, who was in the lead, suddenly begin to leap and dance. To Clark it seemed that the sober little Indian woman had gone suddenly mad. She ran toward him, pointing and sucking her fingers, a Shoshone sign meaning, "These are my people." Riding toward them was a party of Shoshones with Drewer in his Indian disguise at their head. He quickly reported Lewis's whereabouts to Clark. The warriors now broke out into joyful chanting as they escorted the party to the Shoshone camp. As the two companions met, a Shoshone woman ran forward and embraced Sacagawea. They had been taken captive together by the Minnetaree 5 years before, but she had escaped and returned to her people. Now others recognized Sacagawea and ran to greet her. The whole tribe was wild with excitement. The captains clasped hands with a look in their eyes that said many things beyond words. They had never failed each other in the dangers and travail of all the long journey. Both were soon well smeared with grease from the Shoshone hugs. The beaming Cameoate seated Clark on a white robe and placed on his head a crown of 6 precious seashells from the Pacific. He bestowed his name on Clark, a ceremony which was an Indian token of enduring brotherhood. The council circle was formed. Everyone took off his moccasins, and the peace pipe went around. When the speech-making was about to begin, Sacagawea was called to act as interpreter. She came forward and seated herself with her eyes on the ground. When it came her turn to speak, she looked up at Cameoate. With a cry, she leapt up and rushed into his arms, shaking with sobs. He was her own brother. She threw her blanket about them as they embraced and wept. When she sat down again and began to interpret, the tears kept coming, and she stopped, to let them fall unashamed. After the council, she learned that all her family were dead, except 2 brothers and a little son of her oldest sister, whom she immediately adopted. Lewis had always considered the poker-faced squaw incapable of human feeling. He knew better now. Goodbye to the Missouri, August 17, 1805. The white men and the Shoshones camped together at the forks of the Jefferson on the barren backbone of the continent. Indian tribes from west of the Rockies were moving eastward toward the Missouri for the annual buffalo hunt. The white men were facing westward toward the jagged ranges that must scale to reach the Pacific before winter. They were not sorry to say goodbye to the Missouri. Nevertheless, though they had fought against its winding snag-infested currents for months, the river had always been a sure guide through unknown lands. The expedition now split into 2 parties. Clark, with 11 men and 3 pack horses, crossed over the Lemhi Pass and pushed on into the mountains to seek a possible waterway to the Columbia. The river he was following rushed in churning rapids through ever wilder gorges, under towering cliffs, until it disappeared through a chasm in a distant snow-capped mountain range. After sending back word to Lewis, the party, very hungry and discouraged, turned back toward the Shoshone camp. August 18th was a special day for Captain Lewis. That night he wrote in his journal, "This day I completed my 31st year, and conceived that I had in all human probability now existed about half the period which I am to remain in this sublunary world. I reflected that I had as yet done but little, very little indeed, to further the happiness of the human race, or to advance the information of the succeeding generation. I viewed with regret the many hours I have spent in indolence, and now sorely feel the want of that information, which those hours would have given me had they been judiciously expended. But since they are past and cannot be recalled, I dash from the gloomy thought, and resolve in future to redouble my exertions, and at least endeavor to promote those 2 primary objects of human existence, but giving them the aid of that portion of talents which nature and fortune have bestowed on me, or in future to live for mankind as I have heretofore lived for myself." It was an odd and moody bit of autobiography to put into an official record. There was no one to talk to as he looked forward and back on the lonely trail of his own thoughts. He could not know the dark fate he was soon to meet, nor the long glory that would make bright his name. He wrote down his purposes in life and his determination to achieve them. There was plenty of work at hand. The men sunk the canoes with heavy stones in the river, where they could be found on the return trip. All the excess luggage, including their anvil, they cached so that the Indians could not find it. But they treated the famished savages to an enormous fish fry from a catch of over 500 delicious trouts which they had seined out of the river. Sacagawea learned that her brother Cameoate had secretly ordered the Shoshones to start eastward the next day for the Buffalo Plains. She loyally brought the news to her white chief. The desertion of the Indians at that point would leave the expedition without horses or guides. Lewis immediately called in the Shoshone chiefs and accused them of breaking their solemn promises to him. 2 of the chiefs said that they had been against this, but that Camille had given the order. There was a long pause. Camille sat silently smoking his pipe. Behind an impassive mask, he was making a hard choice between his hungry people and his promise to the white strangers. Finally, he said he had been wrong not to keep his promise. He would order the Indians to go back to the Shoshones camp with Lewis's party. Lewis wrote of the Shoshones in his journal. In their conduct toward ourselves, they were kind and obliging, and though on one occasion they seemed willing to neglect us, yet we scarcely knew how to blame the treatment by which we suffered, when we recollected how few civilized chiefs would have hazarded the comforts or the substance of their people for the sake of a few strangers. In their intercourse with strangers, they are frank and communicative, in their dealings perfectly fair, nor have we had during our stay with them any reason to suspect that the display of all our new and valuable wealth has tempted them into a single act of dishonesty. While they have generally shared with us the little they possess, they have always abstained from begging anything from us. After they reached the Shoshone camp, York and Cruzate put everyone in a good humor with dancing and high jinks. In the bartering that followed, the captains secured 29 fine horses. Camille drew a map of the mountain country on the ground. An old Indian guide, who was sure of his way across the mountains, was engaged with his 4 sons. If Indian tribes with women and children can cross the mountains, we can do it, said the men to each other as they parted with the friendly Shoshones.